Oh, before it does the annoying thing where y'all hear me, it hears me, and we're all just hearing each other. Oh, perfect. That's awesome. Cool, 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 cool. Here comes the awkward moment, right, y'all? Oh, before we all hear that. Gotten better at pausing it. I'm gonna share the link, and y'all know what we're gonna do. We are actually, I need volunteers. Can I get 2 volunteers? Just, okay, Zoe's volunteer number 1. I need 1 more volunteer. Sorry, Zoe, you turned your video on.
Volunteering for?
I'll volunteer.
I was gonna ask what we're volunteering for, but yeah, I'll volunteer.
When I get to the intro, when I get to the last part of, and what are y'all doing? If you have not already, I need the subscribe person.
Okay, I got that.
Okay, so Zoe subscribe. Who wants to be like and comment? Y'all were all volunteering to participate, and all of a sudden y'all don't have anything to say.
I could do the whole thing.
You know what, Zoe? Thank you. Only person who's not disappointed me today. Hello, though, for those who are watching the live, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to be getting started very soon once I share this link for all folks to watch. So you just give us a cool second, watch that slide that's rotating around, and we will get started. Okay. Let's see. Just waiting for the internet to cooperate with me and load the Black Feminism post. So if you are watching the stream right now because you were just on it and paying attention to the initial Facebook post, we love you. If you're still waiting for me to share it on all these pages, what would make this easier, and I'll say this later on, actually no, a student will say it later on, would be the following thing to do. So, just say it. Edit, get the link on here. Edit post. Boom. Link. Save. Share to the group. No. Share to a group. High school. Live stream. Starting in 1 minute. Post. Share. Look how everyone can listen to the musings in my mind. Anyone else talk out loud when they're doing things? Like you're explaining the actions of what you're doing to yourself?
No.
Oh, okay. That was very affirmative, Jonah. No, you didn't have to say it like that. You didn't have to say no. Weird. Got it. Heard you. Confidence. Got it. Live stream starts in 1 minute. With the wonderful Abby. Post. All right, now we start. Now we can do the things. Things are shared. I'll share it on my page. While I'm talking, I'm going to make you the host, Abby. And to the wonderful timekeeper who watches these videos and goes through the video, if you want to watch, starts at this time. Thank you. You're really the champion for that. Change host. You're now the host, Abby, so you can start getting that all set up. But I'll start talking, we'll do the thing, and yes. All right, y'all, welcome back to another workshop lecture hosted by Debate Boutique, the one and only, best to do it. And we are so excited to be hosting not only all the lectures that we have been posting on the YouTube channel, but specifically this one for a lot of obvious reasons. You're being hit by a lot of melanin magic in your screen right now. It is the Black Feminism lecture with some applications to water for the water topic, but also looking at the kind of history and the structural position of what it means not to just be a Black woman, but what does the positionality of like Black women mean in the context of anti-Blackness and et cetera, et cetera. I'm super excited for Abby to be giving this lecture. I think she's one of the most perfect folks to do it because it's not just going to be on this high theory, unattainable, what does that mean? How do I grasp it? Stuff, which I think is kind of almost antithetical to the canon that is Black feminism, but also is going to kind of grip you, tell you kind of what is good, what this argument is, and why when you're debating it, there should be an honor and respect and a non-conflation of it as just being, oh, another argument about Black women or some identity politics. That's part of it, but it is not the entirety. So in this lecture, you will be blessed. Outside of that, I got two more things to say. One is that on words are hard. August 15th, new fall services will be launched. They'll be posted here on YouTube, our Instagram, our website, all of that stuff explaining exactly what our private coaching revamp is going to be with the Debate Academy, with other services included too. So if you are looking for a coaching home or just having added services to your debate journey for the fall, we are year round, honey. So it is only the beginning, and we've got some new things in the arsenal that I'm working on to bring forward to the world. So make sure that you stay tuned for that. We're going to have some deals, some promos for folks, because we are keeping it limited, keeping to our boutique service. Engagement is our top priority before anything else. You're not a number, you're a person with a narrative, and we want to make sure that we are focused on that. Number two, and the part that I forgot to say, make this a norm, share information. There's no reason why we should be the only organization that is sharing lectures out here during the summer live time with students who do not have the opportunity to get access from a summer program, either for financial reasons or for time reasons. It is important, not only as one of the only Black owned and Black women owned organizations, that accessibility and representational politics are at the forefront of what we do. So let's make this the hashtag new norm, share information, and make knowledge be power to move this activity forward, and to have all participants present in it, and not just participants from a certain socioeconomic access standpoint. Now, the last thing, and then we are going to move into this lecture, and I actually asked for one of the students to say this because I know y'all are tired of hearing me say it. You can, please though,
You can like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of the live streams from Debate Boutique.
Share this, because this is about to be a word. And without anything left for me to say, Abby, I'm giving you the gauntlet to spread the good gospel, and I am so excited to listen to this lecture.
Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen with you all, and then can I get a thumbs up from this people watching this chat, the students, if you all can see my screen? Perfect. Okay, great. So yes, just like Jasmine did with that wonderful introduction, we will be talking about Black feminism today. We will discuss it at times in a debate-related context, but especially for those of you all who are not in debate or just want to kind of get some understanding about what is this like theoretical framework, Black feminism. We will talk a lot about history, a lot about epistemology. We will talk a lot about anti-Blackness, politics, narratives. We're going to do a holistic conversation into what is Black feminism. So without further ado, so first, I want to address the lecture objectives that we're going to basically hopefully cover everything to the best step that we can during this next hour. So our first objective and main objective, of course, is in general, what is Black feminism? If someone were to ask you a definition of what is Black feminism after this lecture, you would fully, comfortably, and confidently be able to tell them what is Black feminism. Now, our second goal is to talk about the development of Black feminist theory. And to do this, we are first going to start with a very in-depth conversation about history, focused on a Black feminist lens. And then we're going to do a conversation about some general literature that kind of became a turning point into the overall conversation of Black feminism. Our third objective is to understand how Black feminism is key and critical to understanding anti-Blackness. So we're going to start connecting it to the larger structure of anti-Blackness and focus more on some critical race theory and some authors that really highlight how the positionality of the Black female body is very important to understand ways that anti-Blackness not only manifested itself, but also ways that anti-Blackness continues to structure policy. And when we talk about policy specifically, we are then going to get into point 4, where we are talking about how Black feminism and water policy can operate together. Most specifically, we're going to talk about ecology, and we're going to talk about spatial politics and how Black feminism can become a overall coding or mapping for the ways that those two systems or policies operate. All right, so now to address our first objective. This is where I'm going to ask the students in our chat our first question. Based on the question of what is Black feminism, do any of you all have an idea, a possibility, a theory as to what you think might be a definition that we could use to explain what Black feminism is? Okay, and we're gonna go 3, 2, 1. We will call on students. Rita, you first. What do you think might be a possible theory or definition for Black feminism?
I was actually typing in the chat as soon as you called my name. So basically the way that I think about it is feminism in general, the theory of basically equality, more centered around women's rights, and certain things like just how that applies in everyday work, but specifically talking about Black feminism, the structure in which Black women are placed in America, and the theory of what that exactly entails, and the parts of feminism, specifically the broad structure of feminism, how it doesn't really talk about Black women, and how Black women aren't really it's not really intersectional. So that's kind of what Black feminism, in my brain, sounds like.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And just like you said, how we kind of understand traditional feminism as talking about women's rights, and then Black feminism is more focused on that from the positionality of the Black woman. And we will get into why that distinction is very important as we go on through this lecture. And just a quick disclaimer for y'all who are currently students watching the video, I won't really be able to check the chat too much since we are live streaming and moving all over the place. So when we ask questions, it would be really helpful if we just kind of unmute ourselves really fast. But anyway, to continue on. So what is Black feminism? So the ways that I break down Black feminism is there's more to the conversation than just a traditional one-term definition. So Black feminism is, first of all, a theoretical framework. We can use Black feminism to analyze how the unique position of the Black woman shapes structures and positionalities. What we mean by this is how does the specific violence or positionality or genealogy or experiences of Black women, not only within the United States, but globally, give coherency to other structures, such as what it means to be a woman, such as what it means to be a Black person, as well as give coherency to other identities, more individual. So what does it mean to be a white woman in contrast to being a Black woman? What are those key distinctions that Black feminism will then allow us to understand? So it's kind of a groundbreaking, a foundational theoretical framework that is required to then allow us to further understand other positionalities. The next important aspect of Black feminism is it is also an epistemology. So it questions how we understand identity. It questions how do we understand race, gender, sexuality, class, and ability. So even though the two words that clearly pop out are Black and feminism, so we tend to reduce the conversation to thinking that it's only about being Black and being a woman. That is not what Black feminism attempts to encompass, but rather it attempts to challenge the ways that we have Western notions of what it means to be a woman and what it means to then not be a woman, or to, again, to be a white woman versus what it means to be any identity that falls outside of that. And we use Black feminism to be a more intersectional and encompassing conversation or epistemology to understand all race, all class, all gender, all sexuality, all different abilities when we talk about like theories of structural oppression and policies and things like that. Next, it's a lens. So Black feminism isn't something that we just want to apply on a theoretical or a taking note type of framework. It's not just an academic lingo that we're just going to hear about and then dispose of or just use to write papers. It's a lens for how we should view not only history, but reality. And it calls for a centering of this conversation about Black women and other positionalities, so that way we can then change our individual politics and the way that we interact and operate with other people. So it becomes an actual adaptation to our life skill. Next, we also have Black feminism is an experience. So Black feminism, the theoretical framework of it, the epistemology, the lens is all made up and shaped by the individual experiences of the accumulated lives of Black women throughout history, but also Black women in the future. So we'll talk more about how this idea of Black feminism kind of transcends this ideology of time as a linear force. But we understand that Black feminism is kind of this ongoing academic space that works to speak to the lives of those who are currently existing, those who will exist in the future, and those who have existed in the past, and the ways that they all work together to shape different types of structures and unique forms of violence. Cool. So our next slide is we are going to first give like this awesome definition. It's a little lengthy, but I love how it kind of summarizes what it means to be a Black feminist. So through the process of rearticulation, Black feminist thought can offer African-American women a different view of ourselves and our worlds. By taking the core themes of a Black woman's standpoint and infusing them with new meaning, Black feminist thought can stimulate a new consciousness that utilizes Black women's everyday, taken for granted knowledge. Rather than raising consciousness, Black feminist thought affirms, rearticulates, and provides a vehicle for expressing in public a consciousness that quite often already exists. More important, this rearticulated consciousness aims to empower African-American women and stimulate resistance. And that stimulate resistance part, to me, is one of the most powerful parts of what Black feminism does. It allows for us to not only understand the ways that structures operate, but then gives us a framework to then challenge those structures. And this beautiful quote was given to us by Patricia Hill Collins in Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. Cool. So can I get a thumbs up from you all if so far we are good, or if there are any questions at this moment, this would be a great time to ask them. Thumbs up. Okay, so we'll keep moving on now to our second objective. So next, we're going to talk about the development of Black feminist theory, history, and general literature. So this is a great point. If you all have any note-taking stuff, we're going to put out some dates, some facts, some names. So you will want to write these down, especially if you are interested in reading Black feminism when you debate. So let's begin with reviewing history. And Black feminism, first of all, has existed throughout time. It's not something that we can look at and say, oh, there was this specific date when Black feminism was first coined as a term, because we can pull on what Patricia Hill Collins said. It's the lived experiences and giving articulation to those lived experiences. And since Black feminism is founded in the lives of individuals, it has existed since Black women have existed, but it has become a more prominent theoretical framework as history in the United States and in other nations has shown that Black women are often left out of the advancement of not only women, but also the advancement of minority communities as well, which we will further discuss. But we're going to first begin with the narration of history that brings to light the lives that set the stage for not only critical race theory, but also the stage for the world that we live in today. So first, let's go all the way back to European exploration. And when we talk about European exploration, often when we're reading our history books or when we have conversations, even if it's in a more critical sense, we think of European exploration as people coming into Africa, people setting up trading posts, people taking narratives and journals of the communities that live there, bringing it back to their own countries and cultures, and then using that new knowledge that they discovered, right? Which is totally wrong, but using their knowledge or depiction of the communities that lived in Africa to then justify subjection, domination, and enslavement of these very communities. But one of the key factors that is often left out of that genealogy of European exploration is a depiction, the depiction of the Black woman, and how that depiction of her, which was one of the first notes written in a lot of European exploration journals, was used to justify the Black woman as savage, then justify the Black population as savage, and then further take that next step and justify slavery. So to give the narrative of how this happened, during exploration, there was a huge divide between customs and cultures that happened within certain populations in Africa and certain European populations. At this time, we did not have the same ability to share or access information like we do now. So European exploration kind of became this linchpin for modernizing the New World. At this time, we also had the Enlightenment movement happening. We began to have exploration of outside waters and travelment to South America and the Caribbean. So as all of these mass changes are happening, the exploration of Africa played a pivotal role in painting an entire continent, an entire race as something that was not human. And the role of the Black woman in that image was shown when journalists would go back and share their findings to other Europeans. And they would often talk about how the dancing, the vulgarity that the women seem to present themselves with in certain communities. They found that women were at times shirtless in certain communities. Well, the men may have had their certain private areas covered. Women seem to be more out and open than they would have ever allowed a woman to be in Europe. They also talked about dancing and how women would be depicted as more sexualized in dancing. And at the time in Europe, dancing was a very boring 1-2 step. It was something only done for the process of courting. It was not something done for celebration. So when women were out on the floor dancing in Africa, in certain communities, it seemed to them that they were over-sexualized because dancing was something that they depicted as a courting step in Europe. So using these depictions to paint the Black woman in certain communities as over objectifying herself, putting herself in a savage position, they then came to a conclusion that the ability for the community to have love, to care, to have affection towards this Black individual, the Black woman, meant that they themselves, the Black man, also had to be a savage individual. And it allowed for a projection onto the entire communities of these areas that then became colonized and exploited areas to be justified as non-human or animals or savages, which then allowed for the European community to be full conscious, like to make a full conscious and deem it as an ethical, a Christian, a moral choice to bring these people to the New World, to subject these people, to exploit these people, to enslave these people, and through that process, cleanse their souls to then give them the chance of any type of salvation, but at the same time, still eradicate them from the existence, from their very existence in the first place, by killing what it meant to be Black based on European definition. So an individual narrative we can look at that adds warrant or coherency to that understanding is Saartjie Baartman. Now, this is a point where we're going to jump a little bit in terms of time, because again, the unfortunate reality of the position of those who are enslaved is that we do not have the narratives of all of those who have passed, right? We have lost the history, the genealogy, the identities over and over and over again. So these small pieces of information that we do have are vital to help us give coherency or articulate what has possibly happened hundreds and hundreds of times over, because this is the one time in history that it possibly was written down. So when we look at the narrative Saartjie Baartman was born in 1789 in the Cambodian Valley. And where she was born, this area had already been colonized. So when she was born, she worked as a servant when she was very young to start making money since her parents had passed away. Then she was taken to England. And when she was taken to England, she ended up being sold. And as she was sold, she was then put on display for people to look at her body, because they identified Saartjie as having very accentuated breasts and butt. So they then used that to say, hey, she is of a more animalistic nature. So when they put her on display, they put her in zoos, they put her in circus freak shows. And this happened in England, but she was then sold to France. And the same process happened where people were able to grope her body. They were able to throw like trash and degrade like rotten fruits and vegetables at her. They were able to dehumanize her every single day of her existence. And during this process, this dehumanization of this Black woman only worked to gain profitability, not only for the people who owned her at the time, but also it gained profitability in terms of giving like justification, giving satisfaction to what it meant to be a white woman, to have security in their own like self-identity, to say, okay, I may not have that same identification or body shape, but it's because that is something that is grotesque. And then it helps stabilize their own identity, because they can articulate themselves in opposition to that of the Black woman. So it was productive both in the psychic way, but then also productive in an economic way, kind of engaging in that libidinal economy that we often hear talked about in anti-Blackness conversations. So after she was put on display, she ended up passing away from multiple diseases that she had accumulated over her enslavement, and she died in 1816. However, when Saartjie died, the France government was not finished with her. They felt that there was so much value to this physical flesh of the Black woman, to this grotesqueness of her Blackness, of her identity, that they would continue to make profit off of her even after she no longer lived. And they cut out portions of her body, specifically her reproductive organs. They put them in jars and put them on display in a museum, which remained in the museum until the late 1900s. I believe it was in the 1970s that they finally took her remains down, kind of thinking maybe we shouldn't have this on display anymore, but it was because of societal pressure, not because of an ethical or moral change. And even after her remains were taken off of display, they were not disposed of. And Saartjie was not laid to rest. She was not laid to rest until 2002, when the South African government had petitioned for her remains to be returned to them. Now, this petition happened almost 200 years after Saartjie had passed away, which shows how the idea of Black women's bodies, Black women's flesh, Black women's experience totally breaks the bounds of linear time. It's something that exists outside of just when an individual walks this earth, but is used in every way possible to continue to uphold this idea of productivity, this idea of giving coherency to what it means to be white flesh. And then we are going to take a step back and look at another example in history where Black women became vital to cementing what it meant to be in the position of the slave or to be Black within modernity. So at this example we will look at is the Casual Killing Act of 1669. And this act was caused to happen or needed to be placed into law because when there was so much assault happening of Black women on the plantation, it was determined that when Black women were to have their children, one, they would still be slaves. So first, it cemented that these children are going to be property, that there will forever be this legacy of if your mother is Black, you will continue to be a slave. But second of all, it also held Black women accountable for assault. The Killing Act of 1669 basically said that people do not have the right to kill their property of slaves without having a justification such as the slave is resisting. And the reason that this law was needed was because so many masters' wives, the white women who were the wives of the masters on the plantation, had such rage that their husbands were assaulting their slaves and having children with them, that they had a disgusting desire to consistently eradicate via killing these newborn children. So to protect the newborn property of these masters, they created this Casual Killing Act because there was so much violence that was simultaneously happening with the creation or production of the nation state and the building of this plantation. So it also, during the process of creating this Killing Act, the reason that it held Black women accountable for the assault was that it pulled on the empathy or it gave a pathology of, hey, we appeal and understand, the courts are saying we understand for the white women, the masters' wives, that this is a very frustrating experience that you have to go through, that there is something that this woman is doing to attempt to seduce your husband. Well, you may find anger and frustration onto the property and take that out in any way that you want outside of killing. You need to make sure to protect the legacy of future productivity of slavery and not kill the infants. But this did not protect the Black woman who had already faced intense forms of gratuitous violence from further violence simply for existing on the plantation and being forced to do the will of whatever their master chose. So that is where it gets to this last point of it protected the property and not the person. Because again, the person could continue to face torturous violence as long as the property would continue to exist in the future. So as we continue on through our conversation of history, we're going to talk about the abolition of slavery and the women's suffrage movement. So prior to the abolition of slavery, we already have the start of the women's suffrage movement happening. So this began around 1848, but even before the exact date of the 1848, which is when there was a huge collective meeting of women to have to start or kick off the women's suffrage movement. We had women advocating for access to education, voting, political autonomy, all of these main focuses that we think about when we think about the suffrage movement. And a great example of how the women's suffrage movement creates this dichotomy of what it means to be Black versus what it means to be a Black woman versus what it means to just be a woman is that we see the first white woman graduated college in 1788. And this was possible because there were feminist movements existing that were pushing for women to have access to education. But while we are having these movements happening, Black women are still on the plantations. They are still relegated to the sphere of the slave or to the sphere, if they are in a freed state, of the ghettos, the areas of poverty, the areas where they don't have access or are banned. There are laws preventing them from being able to access education, access writing, access any type of political agency. So we don't see the first Black woman graduating from college until almost 100 years later in 1862. So this becomes an example or a kind of overall coding for how the rest of the women's rights movement continued on. It was we then see like in the women's rights movement that we have active like articulation of what it means to be woman in opposition of Black rights. So people would use the like Black agency or Black movements to say, if you are going to give a Black man this type of right, a Black man the right to vote, a Black man the right to freedom, then you are doing women a disfavor in lowering them to such a dishuman levels, to such a lower class level that it becomes an embarrassment to white society as a whole. So this discrimination between what it means to be between white women and Black women, or that white women had during the suffrage movement onto Black women, became a catalyst for what we now recognize as Black feminism. And one of the first pivotal moments was when Sojourner Truth gave her "Ain't I a Woman" speech in 1851. And this is when Truth is calling out the current suffrage movement and saying, hey, I am also a woman, but you are actively eradicating me from your movement because of this continual hatred that you all have for Black flesh. So you cannot be someone who is calling for rights for all women if you are not someone who is also calling for the rights of Black women. Now we can like all clarify and say at this moment in time, we recognize that the suffrage movement is in opposition to Black women. And they built their agenda again against racial equality. And also at this time, this is when we understand what it means to be a feminist. So if you are a feminist who identifies with the suffrage movement, we recognize that it was also identifying in opposition to Black equal rights and specifically Black women's rights. So a horrible, unfortunate, like very painful quote that somebody had decided to give coherency to what the goals of the women's suffrage movement is. We'll quick read through this, and just to give some context, this quote is given by George Train, who was a Democratic millionaire, who was one of the few men who like advocately supported the women's suffrage movement before women had the right to vote. And he began to do some speeches and like propaganda to say, hey, this is why it's necessary for us to give women the right to vote and women the right to like political autonomy. And this was like an example of how this platform of feminism was built in opposition to racial equality. While the dominant party has won with one hand lifted up 2 million Black men and crowned them with honor and dignity of citizenship, wrote Anthony. With the other, they have dethroned 15 million white women, their own mothers and sisters, their own wives and daughters, and cast them under the heel of the lowest orders of manhood. So in a speech, George Train quotes other individuals to explain why it is important that we support the current feminist movement that is happening, but in the process equates not only 2 million Black men to 15 million white women, but also eradicates the existence of Black women from the conversation in and of themselves, which shows how there are layers to oppression. And it's not to say that oppression Olympics exists, but facing one singular form of oppression and facing a different singular form of oppression is not the same as when those two structures intersect themselves and create a unique position where you are facing suffering from a multitude of sides, which is why it's important to understand or use a Black feminist epistemology or lens when we have conversations of race, gender, class, so that way we can talk about those unique forms of violence and how it operates. So I believe this is our last slide that we have for history. We are going to kind of jump a little bit further now into the civil rights movement since we talked about the suffrage movement. So we have already solidified that feminism does not include Black women. So our next hope is to think that the civil rights movement is going to address those changes and help encompass Black women. So the narrative that we are going to use to articulate the civil rights movement is a narrative of Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin was, like, narrative takes place in 1955 when she was 15 years old. And Claudette Colvin actually was the original Rosa Parks. So one day she was on the bus. She was on the bus with 3 other classmates. She was sitting down. She was tired. And of course, there was a group of white people who got on the bus and they told her to get up and give them their seats, even though there were other seats available. Her friends moved and she said no. So she was removed from the bus by police officers, and then she ended up facing a period of probation as consequence for this. However, her actions were not supported by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or she as an individual was not supported by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And to give coherency, the SCLC is a conference that Martin Luther King is known for organizing to be one of the most influential movements during the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King actually came and advocated for Colvin to be released from jail. But after she was released from jail, he went back and had a meeting with other officials, and they agreed that she was too young, too dark, and she was also pregnant at the time. So they would not want to use her as the face for the bus boycott movement that came later. So then they planned an idea of how to make her example, the situation that she had, turn into this nationwide movement. And they did that by 9 months later using Rosa Parks to reenact the very same situation. So while we think in history, while we think in the civil rights movement, that this was just a beautiful, natural time, for all of us to gather ourselves and resist anti-Black violence and oppression, it was actually something that was strategically planned in opposition to a Black woman that they felt was not civilized enough, not the right image. And it's not to say that Rosa Parks is not also a Black woman who experienced some type of playing a specific role and feeding into a stereotype or violence, but how the entire civil rights movement still required Black women to operate within this level of respectability politics. And if Black women did not operate within that politics, then they were eradicated from the movement. They literally would not be forefronted as someone of an issue, as someone who was suffering, as someone who needed to have their issues addressed, but rather it was something that was delegated to the private sphere. And we would privately handle or deal with the issue of the outspoken, the angry Black woman, the Black woman who was also the baby mama, the Black woman who may not have the correct skin complexion. All of these different types of roles the Black woman had to fit to then get brought into the public sphere was simply so that way the movement could be accepted by white society. And again, even the civil rights movement articulated themselves in opposition to the agency or the moving forward of not just Black rights, but Black women's rights as well. So we have two movements, the suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, and neither one of them have spoken to or dealt with the experiences that Black women face, and have only worked to further push Black women to the margins of society. So after history, we're going to talk a little bit about literature. But before I begin this, do we have any questions on history, or can I get a thumbs up if we're all still hanging in there so far? Thank you. Okay. So now the next kind of section of this point 2 is literature that begins to address Black women. So there are 4 people who we're just going to quickly talk about as playing pivotal roles. One is Alice Walker. Alice Walker was the first person who coined the term womanism, and womanism is known for its understanding of the intersectionality between race, class, and gender. She had huge discussions about why it's important for us to begin to diverge away from traditional conversations of feminism, and does a great theoretical framing to what is the importance of incorporating race, class, and gender. Next, we have Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. Both of them had incorporated poetry, but then they also have different novels or articles or literature that talks about the specific position of Black women and a Black feminist lens. So Audre Lorde is known for challenging, one of the main pivotal points is known for challenging what a radical feminist is. And this began in 1979 with one of the books that she had wrote. And she said to be a radical feminist, you have to be a Black feminist. You cannot be a traditional feminist. Bell Hooks is known for taking on the legacy of truth and using this to analyze the position of a Black woman when writing a book, Ain't I a Woman, as well. So she also then incorporates the conversation of how Black women are not viewed as a woman in society and also left out of the feminist movement. And then Patricia Hill Collins is an amazing author who is really known for like advancing this idea of the Black feminist ideology with two amazing books, Black Feminist Thought and Black Sexual Politics, with both focus on the experiences of the Black woman and also gives conversation to what it as to what it means to be a Black feminist. Now, when I outline these authors, I mean to point these ones out, not to say that there are not other Black women who wrote very beautiful literature and important literature that speaks to Black feminism, but these are authors who operate both within and without critical race theory to provide us with a more general conversation of history, movements, and what it means to be a Black feminist. So now for objective 3, how Black feminism is key to understanding anti-Blackness. This is the portion where we'll begin to talk a little bit more about critical race theory, and we'll incorporate some other authors who are just as important as the previous ones we talked about to the conversation of what it means to be Black feminist, but also use a Black feminist lens and more actively use a Black feminist lens to narrate anti-Blackness and structures of oppression. So to begin, we are going to position Black women within theories of anti-Blackness, and we're going to talk about 3 main portions that Black feminism is vital to understanding the structure of anti-Blackness, and especially theories such as Afro-Pessimism. So to begin, we're going to talk about genealogies. So the first point is the exploitation of the oceans and waters is parallel to that of the Black woman. So what this means is when we think about the ways that we conquered Africa, the ways that, and when I say we, I mean America, England, conquered Africa, the ways that we then literally ripped open the ocean, pulled apart the ocean, totally divided and navigated through the ocean to then create this new world, parallels the ways that Black women are culpable for creating on the plantation this new world or this new form of productivity. So we can think of Africa in terms of the motherland, which I'm sure we have heard or used personally that phrase in of ourselves, especially for my other people here who are Black people. We think of Africa as oh, we need to return to the motherland. We need to look at the roots that come from the motherland. Well, the idea of Africa as this motherland, this gendering of the nation, and then we can think of it as the literal violence, the literal assaulting of the land by stealing from that land its resources, its futurity, its futility, its flesh, right? When we stole individuals, populations, communities, and created through the Middle Passage, we birthed this new world. We birthed not only America, but we birthed the entirety of Blackness through the assault of the motherland. And that parallels, again, how on the plantation, this also became a narrative that was then projected onto the Black woman. The entire violence or genealogy that we understand through the Middle Passage became the lived experiences of the flesh and existence and identity of the Black woman on the plantation when they were responsible for birthing the future security of labor production, with having to constantly reproduce more children who would then continue to be sold off into slavery. Another, the next understanding that is key for us to understand theories of anti-Blackness is the distinction of the body versus the flesh. And one author who really does an amazing job of talking about this is Saidiya Hartman. If you are interested in investigating it, especially with the book Scenes of Subjection, To Lose Your Mother, or Venus in Two Acts. But Hartman also does this conversation while talking about anti-Blackness, uses a Black feminist lens to give coherency to that. So when we think of the distinction of the body versus the flesh, we think of different ways of different articulations as to what makes someone have personhood. We think of having existence or agency outside of productivity, which means you have value in and of yourself. You yourself are valuable besides for what you can produce to be valuable. We also see agencies of consent, and we also see the ability to project your will. And when I say project your will, I mean if somebody is doing something not only to yourself, but to your property that you don't like, you are able to use your words to articulate your meaning or what you want to happen, and you will see a material change. So you can project your desires onto other things and make them tangible. So for the body, those are ways that we can understand it. As for the flesh, we recognize that Blackness, especially Black women, exists outside of this positionality of what it means to claim bodyhood or humanness, right? Because the flesh itself, we are reduced to flesh because we do not have value within of ourselves. The only value that society held was based, or like the Black society held, was based on its ability to be productive. And this is not just continuing in slavery, but this is something that continues to shape, that became permanent in slavery, that shapes politics to this day. So when we have like the idea of the flesh only being productive based on, or being valuable based on what it can produce, it's a property or an ownership of white society. We also have the question of consent. And the flesh is unable to consent because there is no human, there is no agency, there is no person within that flesh. You are an object and you are now a commodity. So this is why things such as rape of a Black woman is not something that is considered to be rape on the plantation. It is not something that is illegal, but rather something that is actually promoted in terms of, one, grotesque desire, but two, again, securitizing that future of having like permanent slave labor. When we think of projection of will, we can think of the breaking apart of Black families, and how despite the fact that that is something that came from your flesh, that those are your children, you do not have the ability to project your will, to keep them safe, to hold any type of I am their parent, familial kinship relationship with your children, because you do not have any type of agency. So Black women, using the understanding of how violence in terms of assault and violence in terms of breaking that bond that we think is so sacred of motherhood, which again, when we're talking about language of like Black feminism, we are talking about everything in context of how Western ideologies shape these conversations. So it's not to say that these definitions are what it means to to be a mother, or that actually producing a child is what it means to have motherhood, but rather this is how grammar has structured like these conversations throughout histories of violence, and then use these conversations to articulate what it means in white society. But to continue, for Black women to not be able to access the sacred bond of motherhood means that Black women were not able to be women. And that gives us a conversation of ungendering the slave. And this conversation is done like held beautifully by Spillers. And I would really suggest, if you're interested in anti-Blackness and Black feminism, to read the book Spillers has of Papa's Maybe, Mama's Baby. And it does an analysis as to how there was this law that was passed that said that whoever your mother was, if your mother was a slave, then you are going to follow in her footsteps and always be a slave. So first, we have the conversation of the intersection of assault and the lash of the whip. So by understanding the unique ways that Black women were simultaneously assaulted by masters, but then also faced physical violence, gave understanding to not only the lack, but the impossibility for there to ever be empathy or intimacy between the master and the slave. So it even pulled in, or Hartman is able to pull on this conversation when talking about the ideas of consent as well, right? Like when we think of consent, how can an object or how can a slave consent to their master? Because you are in the position of the slave in the first place. So this power dynamic prevents you from being able to access that form of agency. But also Spillers does the work to say when there is this intimate form of violence, this gratuitous form of violence that happens not only through assault, but then also through the lash of the whip, it shows that Black women exist like outside these understandings of what it means to be human, and that this is projected onto Blackness in of itself, and that Blackness is eradicated from the position of the human. She also uses this phrase, partus sequitur vetrem. It's Latin, so it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it was the law that was passed that basically says when you come from the womb of the Black woman, you will then follow in her footsteps, and you will also be a slave. So when a master assaulted a slave, the children were doomed to slavery. But it also works in contradiction, or not contradiction, but it works parallel to the conversation of like this intersection of the assault and the lash of the whip. So how, is there to be any type of intimacy, desire for an individual while also able to inflict such distinct forms of gratuitous violence onto that person as well? Then we get to the next claim that Spillers makes and says that because of one, the mother being responsible or taking claim for the position of the child, and also two, this unique form of violence that the Black woman faces on the plantation, that the Black slave is unable to access womanhood, and thus the slave becomes ungendered. So we understand during this time that womanhood is based in articulation of white womanhood. And white womanhood means that one, the father gives their last name to their children. The mother is delegated to the domestic sphere, who does not do hard labor, but rather she's in charge of knitting, taking care of the children. And also that fact in of itself, she is taking care of her own children. All of these portions of what it means to be a woman are something that the Black women can never access. The Black woman, pregnant or not, is working just as hard as the men are working. The Black woman is not able to take care of her children because she is unable to have children of her own, but only produce a commodity for society to use for the future. And then also the Black woman takes on the position of that is traditionally relegated to the man, where her last name or her Blackness becomes the identifier for her children. So this makes it so the Black family is unable to exist. And it completely ungenders the slave because it's impossible for them to, for the Black family to mimic or follow what is recognized as the white nuclear family. And the violence that the Black woman faces then gives legitimacy to the bonds and relationship of the white family, but also gives security and futurity because it can never be destroyed through the idea of having mixed children, or it can never be destroyed through the idea of a relationship between a Black woman and a Black man creating some type of nuclear family themselves, because their family will always operate outside the bounds of what it means to be a family within civil society. All right, quick breather before we jump into our last objective. How are we doing? Do we have any questions on the theory? Is there any language that we're not understanding yet?
I don't know if I have a question, but okay, it's kind of a question. So a little bit kind of a question. So on the kind of the ungendering the slave portion, it kind of sounds a lot to me kind of like the concept of being Black before you are a woman or woman before you are Black type thing that a lot of people face, and the fact that you can't that you have to be both at once instead. So kind of the Black slave can never access womanhood because she never actually gets to experience womanhood because she is a slave. Do you feel like the argument in between having to choose in between being a woman and Black comes a lot from the ungendering the slave concept?
Yeah, so I have to be honest, when I first looked into the slave ungendering argument, that is exactly how I felt. And I was like, okay, I feel like this kind of mitigates the experiences that I face where I am both, or when I'm claiming that I am both. And I feel like it kind of matches that articulation of that you have to pick one or address one to then discuss or talk about the other. We have to solve anti-Blackness before we can talk about what it means to be a woman. And the slave ungendered argument is the exact opposite of saying you have to talk about just Blackness first before you can talk about a woman. Rather, it gives more agency, more warrant as to why we have to use Black feminism to analyze history. Because specifically, Spiller's slave ungendered argument is saying that the reasons that we're able to have certain stereotypes, the reasons that we're able to have like certain forms of violence, both onto Black women and to Black men, the reasons that the Black family is consistently be broken apart is because we forced the position of the Black woman to give coherency to the position of the white woman, or to give security. So it was still the Black female body, it was still the Black female flesh, but it's understanding that in terms of grammar, we understand what it means to be a woman as a very traditional white nuclear ideology. And that's why we have certain notions of femininity such as domestic, certain notions of femininity as such as more silent or respectable, right? But those were all privileges that were never afforded to the Black woman. So all of these things that were like, oh, our women, our white women are people who are respectful. They are people who only talk when they're spoken to. They stay in the house and do the domestic chores. They gave security to their lifestyle, to their culture that operated at this time, because to have something that is, you have to have something that is not, something that is the opposite of it, right? That's kind of how we understand American grammar. If you have like the day, then you also have night. So if we have what it means to be a woman, we also have to have what it means to be a savage, uncivilized, grotesque. And we use the Black women to give coherency to what it means to be like a civilized woman. So rather than saying you have to address what it means to be Black first, it's saying that you have to look at the unique position of the Black female body, especially on the plantation and throughout history, and the unique violence that they were able to go through by being denied what it means to be a woman, but then simultaneously using that denial to create what it means to be a white woman. And then also being like burdened with the roles of what it means to be in a nuclear family, the man as well, to then understand and fully encompass the conversation of how anti-Blackness and like patriarchal and like sexist violence works as a calculated form of oppression, where it targets different identities in a very specific, personalized, manifested way to uphold different structures in different positionalities. Does that kind of help where it sounds at first like it's saying focus on Blackness first, but really it's saying you have to focus on the Black female flesh?
That makes sense.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's jump into our last topic, where we're going to talk about Black feminism and water policy. So we are first going to talk about how Black feminism is possible to be viewed as ecology. There is a huge movement in literature right now to articulate Black feminism as ecology. So one of the articles that does this analysis is by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is another Black feminist and also does a lot of understanding, like analysis of like queer ideology and anti-Blackness. Amazing author to look into if you are interested in some of those conversations. But in Gumbs' article, Seek the Roots, an immersive and interactive archive of Black feminist practice, they do this short analysis to kind of summarize how Black feminism is ecology. So there is a queer ecology to the practice of digging for and growing from roots that are never writ, miniseries large. And side note on this, Alexis is actively like quoting or citing other authors as well. But to continue, but rather are grounded in unmarked graves, circumcised by death, burn out in obscurity. But we contemporary Black feminist thinkers, farmers, grassroots green thumbs are queer ecologists. So what Alexis Gumbs does during this article is pulls on different conversations that Black feminists are having all around the internet through different forms of like articles, through blogs, through different forms of media conversations, videos, and uses it to say like, we are a group that is growing for our roots, but our roots were formed in the afterlife of slavery. These roots were formed in a position of violence, and relates the roots literally as a metaphor kind of for how a tree, right, continuously spreads their roots out, is saying that this is what is happening with Black feminism. It is a queer ecology that is evolving into the conversation that one is one with nature and of itself and thinks of nature in a different way, but two is a necessary way for us to understand like what it means to be Black, but then also to tune into what it means to be like a Black farmer, a Black grassroots person, a Black green thumb, to think of Blackness, Black feminism as a queer ecology. And it does it through this metaphor of the roots, but then also connects that metaphor to networking that is currently happening. Now, outside of this current movement for Black feminism as a new ecology, which again is a great way to understand like water policy and environmental regulations, another way that we can look at Black feminism is giving coherency to spatial politics and environmental racism. So the main takeaway from this section is that the coordinates for dumping zones are that of Black women's flesh. And what I mean by that is it comes in multiple layers. So first, we're going to kind of like stack on those layers. So to begin, we're going to draw on history, and we're going to draw on the impossible position or the paradox of the Black woman. So when we talk about the paradox of the Black woman, we can pull on the conversation that we had previously with the slave ungendered when we talked about spillers, and we talked about how the Black woman is simultaneously eradicated from existence while also giving coherency. Like she needs to exist to give coherency to white womanhood, but her identity in of itself has to be eradicated through these forms of gratuitous violence to reduce her to only the flesh. So when we say paradox, we're saying that it exists in this position of contradictions. And that's how we understand Blackness in society. Blackness must exist for productivity, but Blackness identity-wise is something that we always work to destroy, right? Which is why we face violence, which is why we consistently see Black people like relegated to prisons. But it's still necessary in prisons, for example, for Black people to still be alive because they need to produce for the state, i.e. that free labor. So it's that libidinal economy, this desire to eradicate Blackness, but also this exchange for the value of future productivity that Blackness allows for us to have. So one, we exist in this position of the paradox. Now, second, since we exist in this position of the paradox, that gives us coherency to understanding how Black women are simultaneously culpable for creating the world and then also destroying the world. So when we think of the law that was established where if a Black woman were to have a child, that child was going to be a slave and it was to take after their mother. The Black woman is responsible for one, destroying whiteness. They destroyed the legacy of the father, of the white father who had assaulted her through the idea, through the ability for her to conceive a child. Whiteness was destroyed. She was culpable for destroying that world. But two, she was simultaneously creating a future of productivity. So she was also culpable and required to continue to physically produce using her body to then make a security of free labor, right? So the Black woman is now responsible for destroying the world, but creating the world at the same time. And this metaphor is able to, or example applies to like a multitude of situations, which we can address as we go on. So third, this now pulls on grammar. So we're going to add grammar to this conversation and how how grammar further pollutes the actual body and the space that the Black woman occupies. So when we get this idea of the Black woman being simultaneously overproductive, such as producing for society this immense amount of children, but also being underproductive, she is depicted in the status quo as lazy, right? As someone who is not taking responsibility, someone who is not a hard worker, somebody who does not someone who just relies on system social assistance and things like that. These are often stereotypes that we use to depict the position of the Black woman. We use grammar or articulate the experiences or positionalities that Black women have. We use that to then give coherency to certain language or grammar, and we use that to then pollute spaces. So we can think of the example of the baby mama or the welfare queen. So the baby mama, in terms of first being culpable for creating and destroying the world, is someone who is responsible for creating future generations, but is also responsible for destroying the world because they are not being productive to society outside of producing children. The baby mama is somebody who is viewed as ratchet and ghetto, and somebody who then exists in a space that we recognize as the ghetto. So originally we used words like ghetto to recognize places where a certain community lived, a certain population lived. We thought of places as ghetto when we talked about the Holocaust. Those terms were used to identify actual geographical locations. But now the grammar that we apply to the Black woman as being somebody who exists in this paradox and overproduces and underproduces as the Black woman's flesh is grotesque is ways that we turn the word from ghetto of just a geographical location to having a level or multitude of meanings to it, where it means something that is disgusting, something that is dirty, something that is not productive, something that exists in society but does not do for society in and of itself. Well, it may be the source of cheap labor, it doesn't mean it's something that has value outside of that labor production that it produces. So we'll think of people who live in poverty, who may be the root of our working force. These people who we really need to actually have in terms of the pandemic, right? We have these essential workers, people who exist in these positions of poverty, who we need for production, who we literally need to continue to get society to operate on a day-to-day basis, the essential workers that we have, but they exist in a space that the actual geographical location they live in is viewed as disgusting, right? Viewed as grotesque. And we use the position of the Black woman in narratives of such as the baby mama, narratives of the welfare queen, to then give spatial locations a multitude of meanings and give grammar itself a multitude of meanings that then make grammar and space inexorably tied together. So we no longer can think of ghetto without thinking of anti-Blackness, and without thinking of the Black woman, without having images of the baby mama pop in our head, without having images of the welfare queen pop in our head. We think of things such as the welfare queen and the baby mama, and we will always think of a Black woman, or it's inexorably tied to a Black woman. Even if you attempt to challenge what these notions mean to you personally, it means in terms of a theoretical framework. It was perfected on the flesh of a Black woman to then give coordinates to these, to grammar and to space. And last, as we connect this conversation of the paradox of Black women being simultaneously culpable for creating and destroying the world, and how that paradox that they exist in means that these stereotypes of the welfare queen and the baby mama get articulated to spatial locations and then blacken those locations, and also then get articulated into grammar and blacken grammar, and how all of these pieces come together to shape environmental policy. So policy consumes this narrative of spatial politics existing on the flesh of Black women and uses it to say, since ghetto means dirty, that means the ghetto is now a dumping zone, which means the Detroit River can have higher amounts of pollution than a place like Lake Michigan, where Lake Michigan is an area where we expect people to have beautiful homes and beaches owned by the rich, the wealthy, the white, and most likely male. we think of the Hudson River. The Hudson River is also a more predominantly Black space, but that is something that can be polluted in ways different than a private area, such as like the West Keys of Florida, can not have the same type of large corporations polluting, because that again is a privatized white male space. But the Hudson River is a ghettoized Black, dirty, polluted space. This also parallels with the Mississippi River as well. We can think of all these coordinated spaces that are surrounded by Black and brown communities that follow this conversation of follows this genealogy of these people and populations that exist in the area, of existing in this paradoxical position. And we also recognize that the Black woman becomes the one who is fully responsible or culpable. Because when we think of like the baby mama, right? The baby mama is present in the narrative, but the baby daddy is not. And it's not to say that we don't have the conversation about the absent father, but it's the fact that the father is absent. So therefore the mother is now responsible for the upbringing of the children, is now responsible for cleaning of the spaces, is now responsible for everything that happens within the home and within the space that she occupies. She is now the one who holds the entire onus for changing or bettering the world. Yet she is also responsible by society and capitalism and the libidinal economy to continue to produce that like infinite labor source. So the summary or takeaway of this is that when we discuss water resources and pollution, there is much more to the narrative than just policy, but also the why. There's the why here, there's the why is it these people, and then there is what does that pollution represent. So especially when we talked about the conversation of grammar, we recognize that pollution is not just pollution because we have to get rid of areas and we think that Black people are more fungible or at a lower class level, but the pollution also represents like a psychic or metaphysical act of deregulating Blackness to a sphere of the unthought, to continue to recognize Blackness as grotesque. Pollution also works to give coherency to the idea that Blackness is always like grotesque and dirty, and to give coherency to the idea of the ghetto as an unclean space, but then also Black flesh in of itself as something that is unclean. And then Blackness itself becomes the pollutant to society. They are two structures that consistently feed off of each other, and you cannot have one without the other. As long as like anti-Blackness operates, and as long as the positionality of the Black female body exists within society, there will always be a form of environmental pollution because the flesh itself will always be articulated as the pollutant. So once the flesh moved into that space, then the pollution will follow. And if we attempt to move the flesh out of the space, the flesh can only be deregulated to an area that is already suffering from that same form of pollution. Okay, so that was a lot. And we kind of ended on a high note as well. And we talked about a lot of history. We talked about anti-Blackness, some theoretical analysis, and then we tried to connect it back to the ways that like policy operates in the status quo and environmental racism. So take a second and digest. But at this time, are there any questions, thoughts, concerns? Anyone who just has something that you want to speak your mind, feel free to say whatever you feel like saying.
This may be biased because of obvious reasons, but this has been my favorite lecture, I think, so far. So, not biased at all, though.
Thanks, Rita. I appreciate it.
What you mean?
I just so happen to be Black and a woman. So, it may be a little bit biased, but, also it was a great lecture.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Are there any questions that anyone has, or if everyone could give me a thumbs up if you all are like, I'm digesting and taking this in as a moment, I'm cool. That would be really helpful. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up, thumbs up. Good. Okay, great. So just again, as a takeaway, when we talk about women, like Black feminism and identity, Black feminism does not peg on traditional terms of what it means to be a woman based on like being a cis, heterosexual, able-bodied white woman, but rather Black feminism is a framework that allows for us to challenge all of those ideologies. So in Black feminist literature, when we refer to womanhood or womanism or what it means to be a woman, we are referring to it through the lens of how white society during the afterlife of slavery articulated these forms of violence, or on the plantation created what it meant to be a woman, and then in the afterlife of slavery uses violence to uphold these notions of like white femininity. And this is why it's important for us to always use like a Black feminist lens when we are having conversations of anti-Blackness, conversations of like sexuality or gender, because a lot of these practices, a lot of these forms of violence were first perfected on the flesh of the Black woman. So just to make sure that we all are on the same summarizing page, but other than that, thank you all so much for attending this lecture. Jasmine, I will stop sharing and send it back to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, I think that the sentiments in the chat say it all. So thank you so much, Abby, for an excellent, excellent, excellent workshop lecture. I think that this will be helpful to all students, not only ours, but to anyone who just wanted to understand more of like what this Canada Scholarship is, how it can be utilized in the context of debate, and also just like in life, because you ain't a feminist. And I say this with my full chest. If you are not a Black feminist, you are part of the problem. So with that being said, I'm going to end the live stream. So for my YouTube folks, peace out, subscribe, and you'll see our faces again. Wait, I'm not the host. I can't. Wait, I'm not the host. I can't end it. We love a second goodbye. Well, yeah, I can't end the live stream, Abby. You're still the host. No, you're good.
All right, me trying to like